The hot Georgia sun beat down relentlessly as Officer Mike Hansen pulled his patrol car to the curb. Another routine traffic stop, he thought. Little did he know this encounter would change lives forever. Across the street, 62-year-old James Washington was locking up his barbershop for the day. The Air Force veteran moved a bit slower these days, but he still took pride in serving his community, just as he'd served his country. As James headed to his car, he noticed the police lights flashing. Officer Hansen approached the stopped vehicle, hand resting cautiously on his holster. The driver, a young black man, seemed agitated. Voices grew louder. In a split second, the situation spiraled out of control. James felt his heart race as he watched the scene unfold. Without thinking, he hurried across the street. "Now hold on, let's all just take a breath here," he called out, hoping to diffuse the tension. Officer Hansen spun around, startled by the newcomer. "Sir, stay back," he barked. But James kept walking, hands raised. "I'm just trying to help, officer. No need for this too." The crack of the taser cut through the air. James' body went rigid, then crumpled to the pavement. "Oh God, oh God," Officer Hansen muttered, rushing to the fallen man's side. The young driver stood frozen in shock. Panicked voices filled the air as bystanders called for help. As the ambulance sped James to the hospital, Officer Hansen paced the sidewalk, visibly shaken. He never meant for this to happen. It was just supposed to be a regular traffic stop. Now a man lay fighting for his life because of his actions. The emergency room buzzed with activity as doctors worked to stabilize James. His wife, Sandra, arrived in tears, demanding answers. "He has a heart condition," she sobbed. He was just trying to help. How could this happen? Across town, a phone rang in the office of District Attorney Marcus Washington. "Dad's in the hospital," a shaky voice said. "Some cop tased him. They don't know if he's gonna make it." Marcus felt the world tilt beneath him. His father? Taste? It didn't make sense. As the city's first black DA, Marcus had worked tirelessly to build trust between law enforcement and the community. Now his own father lay in critical condition, another victim of the very system Marcus was trying to change. Word spread quickly through the close-knit neighborhood. By nightfall, a crowd had gathered outside the hospital, holding candles and demanding justice. Local news vans lined the street, hungry for the latest updates on the unfolding drama. Inside the IQ, James clung to life, machines beeping a tenuous rhythm. Sandra clutched his hand, whispering prayers. Marcus paced the hallway, torn between grief and fury. How many times had he assured people that things were getting better, that the system could work for everyone if given a chance? Now those words felt hollow in the face of his father's suffering. Across town, Officer Hansen sat in his darkened living room, replaying the incident over and over in his mind. He'd always prided himself on being one of the good cops, fair and professional, but in that split second of fear and poor judgment, he'd become everything he despised. The look of shock and betrayal in James' eyes haunted him. As dawn broke, the city held its breath. Would James survive? Would charges be filed? Could this community ever heal from such a devastating breach of trust? The next 24 hours would prove critical, not just for James' recovery, but for the very soul of a city on edge. Lines were being drawn, tensions rising. One man's actions had set in motion a chain of events that threatened to tear the community apart. Marcus Washington stared out the hospital window, watching the crowd below grow larger by the hour. As a son, he ached to see justice for his father. As district attorney, he knew the eyes of the nation would soon be upon them, watching to see how this explosive situation would be handled. The young man from the traffic stop had come forward, eager to share his side of the story. Cell phone footage was already circulating online, feeding a frenzy of outrage. Activist groups were mobilizing, demanding Officer Hansen's immediate arrest. But Marcus knew rushing to judgment could only inflame an already volatile situation. The truth was rarely black and white, especially in cases like these. He needed to be the voice of reason to ensure that justice, true justice, was served. As he turned back to his father's bedside, Marcus felt the weight of responsibility settle heavily on his shoulders. The decisions he made in the coming days would have far-reaching consequences, not just for his family, but for the entire community. James stirred slightly, his eyes fluttering open. Sandra leaned in close, hope booming on her tear-stained face. "James? Can you hear me, honey?" Marcus held his breath, willing his father to respond. After everything that had happened, would James still be the man they knew and loved? Or had this senseless act of violence changed him forever? The monitors beat steadily as James struggled to focus. His gaze settled on Marcus, a flicker of recognition sparking in his eyes. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came. In that moment of suspended anticipation, a nurse burst into the room. "Mr. Washington," she said breathlessly, "there's someone here to see you. Says he's the officer involved in the incident." Marcus felt a surge of conflicting emotions. Fury at the man who'd hurt his father warred with his ingrained sense of justice and the need to hear all sides. As footsteps approached down the hall, the air in the room grew thick with tension. What would happen when victim and aggressor came face to face? Could any words heal the damage that had been done? The door creaked open slowly, revealing a pale and visibly shaken Officer Hansen. He stood frozen in the doorway, eyes locked on James' fragile form in the hospital bed. In that charged moment, the fate of a family, a police force, and an entire community hung in the balance. The next word spoken would set the course for healing or deepen the wounds of mistrust and pain. James Washington, a man who'd faced danger in war and peace, now faced his greatest challenge yet. Could he find it in his heart to forgive, or would bitterness and anger prevail, fueling a cycle of hatred that threatened to consume them all? As Officer Hansen took a tentative step into the room, the machines monitoring James' vital signs began to beat more rapidly. The next few minutes would determine far more than one man's fate. They would reveal the true character of a community pushed to its breaking point. The tension in the hospital room was palpable as Officer Hansen stepped inside. His eyes darted between James, still weak in the hospital bed, and Marcus, whose face was a mask of barely contained emotion. Sandra gripped her husband's hand tighter, her body tensed as if to shield him from further harm. I'm so sorry," Officer Hansen stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. "I never meant for any of this to happen." Before anyone could respond, James raised a shaky hand. "Water," he rasped, his first word since regaining consciousness. Sandra quickly helped him take a sip, all eyes still locked on the uniformed figure by the door. Marcus took a deep breath, years of legal training kicking in despite the turmoil of his emotions. "Officer Hansen," he said evenly, "I think it's best if we continue this conversation elsewhere. My father needs rest." As they stepped into the hallway, the sounds of the busy hospital faded into the background. Marcus studied the man before him, not much older than himself, with circles under his eyes and a haunted look that spoke of sleepless nights. "I want to hear exactly what happened," Marcus said. "Every detail." Officer Hansen nodded, swallowing hard. It was supposed to be a routine traffic stop. As the officer recounted the events, Marcus felt his anger warring with his professional instincts. The story painted a picture of a situation that had spiraled out of control in seconds, fueled by fear and misunderstanding on both sides. "When your father approached, I panicked," Hansen admitted, his voice cracking. "I've been on edge lately. There have been threats against officers, and I don't know what I thought. It all happened so fast." Marcus closed his eyes, trying to process the information. He'd seen cases like this before, from both sides of the courtroom. The complexities of split-second decisions, the weight of bias and fear, the devastating consequences of a moment's misjudgment. "You do realize the gravity of this situation?" Marcus asked. "My father is a respected member of this community, a veteran, and now he's fighting for his life because of your actions." Hansen nodded, his shoulders slumping. "I know, and I'll accept whatever consequences come. I needed to apologize, to try to make this right somehow." As they talked, neither man noticed the small crowd gathering at the end of the hallway. Hospital staff, patients, and visitors whispered among themselves, some recording snippets of the conversation on their phones. Inside the room, James drifted in and out of consciousness. Fragments of memory flashed through his mind, the hot sidewalk against his cheek, the searing pain in his chest, the terrified faces of onlookers. But mixed with these images were older ones. Marching in formation under a blazing sun, the weight of responsibility as he led men into danger, the pride of serving his country. Sandra watched her husband's face, seeing the flicker of emotions even in his weakened state. She thought back to when they first met, two idealistic young people believing they could change the world. James had always been the peacemaker, the one who could find common ground in the most difficult situations. Even as he lay here, injured by the very system he'd always believed in, Sandra knew he'd find a way to bring healing if he could. Outside the hospital, the crowd continued to grow. Word had spread quickly through social media, and now protesters lined the sidewalks, holding signs demanding justice. Local news crews jockeyed for position, eager to catch a glimpse of the key players in this unfolding drama. Among the crowd, a young woman named Tisha pushed her way to the front. She'd been there that day, had recorded the incident on her phone. The video had already gone viral, sparking heated debates online and in homes across the city. Tisha caught sight of a familiar face, Kevin, the young man who'd been pulled over that fateful day. He stood off to the side, looking uncomfortable with all the attention. "Kevin," she called out, waving him over. "Have you talked to the lawyers yet? Your video could be crucial evidence." Kevin shook his head, his expression troubled. "I don't know, Tisha. I'm not sure I want to get more involved. This whole thing, it's bigger than I ever imagined." As they talked, neither noticed the unmarked car pulling up to the curb. Two men in suits stepped out, their faces grim. They made their way through the crowd, flashing badges to clear a path. Back inside, Marcus had just finished hearing Officer Hanson's account when a nurse approached, looking flustered. "Mr. Washington, there are some men here from Internal Affairs. They're insisting on speaking with you and Officer Hanson immediately." Marcus felt a fresh wave of tension wash over him. Internal Affairs meant the department was taking this seriously, but it also meant things were about to get even more complicated. As the investigators were shown to a private room, whispers rippled through the hospital. Speculation ran wild. Was an arrest imminent? Would charges be filed? How high up the chain of command would this investigation go? In the ICU, James stirred again. Sandra leaned in close, stroking his arm gently. "It's okay, honey, you're safe now." James' eyes fluttered open, more focused this time. He looked at his wife, then at the empty doorway where Officer Hanson had stood. "The young man," he said softly. "Is he all right?" Sandra felt tears welling up. Even now, James' first thought was for others. "He's fine," she assured him. "Everyone's okay, just rest now." But as James drifted off again, Sandra couldn't help but wonder, would anything ever really be okay again? This incident had exposed raw wounds in their community, bringing long simmering tensions to the surface. Outside, the crowd continued to grow. People from all walks of life stood shoulder to shoulder, united in their demand for answers. But beneath the shared anger, deeper questions lurked. How had it come to this? And more importantly, where did they go from here? As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the hospital grounds, no one could shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. The story of James Washington, a respected veteran brought low by a single moment of fear and misunderstanding, had become a flashpoint for a much larger conversation. In homes and offices across the city, people gathered around televisions and computer screens, hungry for updates. Social media buzzed with hashtags and calls to action. Lines were being drawn, sides taken. But in a quiet hospital room, removed from the growing storm outside, a man who had seen the best and worst of humanity continued to fight for his life. And in his struggle lay the seeds of a resolution no one could yet imagine. As night fell, the city seemed to hold its breath. The crowd outside the hospital had thinned, but a dedicated group remained, their candles flickering in the darkness. Inside, James Washington's condition had stabilized, but he was far from out of the woods. Marcus paced the waiting room, his mind racing. The meeting with Internal Affairs had been intense, leaving him with more questions than answers. They grilled Officer Hanson for hours, but Marcus knew this was just the beginning of a long and complicated process. Across town, in a dimly lit bar, Kevin nursed a beer, trying to shake off the events of the day. He'd come near seeking escape, but found himself instead reliving the moment over and over. The flash of the taser, the sickening thud as Mr. Washington hit the ground. Kevin had always tried to keep his head down, to avoid trouble. Now he found himself at the center of a storm he never saw coming. "Hey, ain't you the guy from the video?" a voice called out. Kevin looked up to see a group of men watching him, their expressions a mix of curiosity and something darker. He quickly paid his tab and slipped out into the night, heart pounding. Meanwhile, in a suburban home miles from the hospital, Officer Hansen sat at his kitchen table, head in his hands. His wife, Lisa, watched him worriedly from the doorway. "Mike, please, you need to eat something," she pleaded. Hansen looked up, his eyes red-rimmed. "How can I?" he asked. "A man's fighting for his life because of me, because I let fear get the better of me." Lisa sat down beside him, taking his hand. "You made a mistake," she said softly. "A terrible mistake, but you're trying to make it right. That has to count for something." As they talked, neither noticed their teenage son, Tyler, listening from the top of the stairs. He'd always looked up to his dad, had dreamed of following in his footsteps. Now, everything he thought he knew about right and wrong, about heroes and villains, seemed to be crumbling. Back at the hospital, Sandra Washington finally convinced Marcus to go home and get some rest. As he walked to his car, he was stopped by a young woman he recognized from the crowd earlier. "Mr. Washington," she said, "I'm Tisha. I was there that day. I have video of what happened." Marcus felt a surge of conflicting emotions. As a DA, he knew the value of eyewitness evidence. But as a son, he dreaded seeing his father's pain captured for the world to see. "Have you shown this to anyone else?" he asked. Tisha shook her head. "No, but people are offering money for it. I don't know what to do." Marcus took a deep breath. "Come to my office tomorrow," he said. "We'll talk about it properly." As Tisha walked away, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that this video could change everything. But would it bring justice, or just fuel the fires of outrage already burning in the community? Across the city, in a late-night emergency meeting, Mayor Thompson rubbed his temples in frustration. "This situation is a powder keg," he told his advisors. "We need to get ahead of it before things spiral out of control." His chief of staff, a sharp-eyed woman named Alicia, spoke up. "Sir, maybe we should reach out to community leaders. Try to open a dialogue before positions become too entrenched." The mayor nodded slowly. "Set it up. And get me everything we have on Officer Hansen's record. I want to know if there's been any hint of trouble before this." As the meeting continued, none of them noticed the janitor pausing a moment too long outside the door, his ears straining to catch every word. Dawn was breaking as Sandra Washington finally dozed off in the chair beside her husband's bed. She was startled awake by a gentle touch on her arm. Looking up, she saw James watching her, his eyes clearer than they'd been since the incident. "Sandra," he said softly, "I need to talk to that officer." She blinked in surprise. "James, are you sure? After what he did?" James cut her off with a weak wave of his hand. "I need to understand," he said, "and he needs to understand. It's the only way forward." As Sandra struggled with her husband's request across town, Officer Hansen was just beginning his shift. The station was quiet, his fellow officers giving him a wide berth. No one quite knew what to say. Hansen had just sat down at his desk when the captain called him into his office. "Mike," he said gravely, "I'm afraid I'm going to have to ask for your badge and gun. You're on administrative leave, effective immediately." As Hansen handed over his equipment, he felt as if he were in a dream, or maybe a nightmare. How had everything gone so wrong so quickly? Back at the hospital, Marcus arrived to find his mother in tears. "Dad wants to talk to him," she said. "To that officer, I don't know if I can bear it." Marcus felt torn. As a lawyer, he knew any conversation between his father and Officer Hansen could have serious legal implications. But as a son, he understood his father's need for answers, for some kind of resolution. Before he could respond, a commotion in the hallway caught their attention. They looked up to see Kevin being escorted in by two police officers, his face a mask of fear and confusion. "What's going on?" Marcus demanded, stepping into the hall. One of the officers, a grizzled veteran named Rodriguez, met his eyes. "Sorry to disturb you, Mr. Washington, but this young man has some information about what happened that day. Says he wants to set the record straight." As Kevin was led into a private room for questioning, Marcus felt the pieces of this complex puzzle shifting once again. What new revelation was about to come to light? And how would it affect the delicate balance of a city on edge? In homes and offices across the city, people went about their morning routines, but there was an undercurrent of tension in every conversation. Everyone seemed to be waiting, though for what they couldn't quite say. Justice? Healing? or perhaps for the spark that would finally ignite this simmering powder keg of emotions and long-buried grievances. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, casting harsh light on a city divided, no one could shake the feeling that they were standing on the brink of something momentous. The story of James Washington and Officer Hanson had become more than just a single incident. It had become a mirror, reflecting back the fears, hopes, and deep-seated beliefs of an entire community. And as the various players in this unfolding drama prepared to face another day of questions and soul-searching, one thing became clear: nothing would ever be quite the same again. As the day wore on, tension in the city reached a fever pitch. News of Kevin's questioning spread like wildfire, sparking fresh speculation and debate. Outside the hospital, the crowd swelled once again, their chants for justice growing louder by the hour. Inside, James Washington's request to speak with Officer Hanson had set off a flurry of activity. Marcus found himself caught in the middle, torn between his roles as son, district attorney, and voice of reason in an increasingly volatile situation. "Dad, are you absolutely sure about this?" Marcus asked, standing at his father's bedside. James nodded weakly, his eyes filled with a determination that belied his frail state. "It's the only way, son," he said. "We need to break this cycle of fear and mistrust. It has to start somewhere." As Marcus left to make the necessary arrangements, he bumped into Tisha in the hallway. She looked nervous, clutching her phone tightly. "Mr. Washington, I've been thinking about that video," she said. I think I need to release it. People deserve to know the truth." Marcus felt his heart race. The video could change everything, but was the city ready for the raw truth it contained? Before he could respond, a commotion erupted down the hall. Officer Hanson had arrived, escorted by internal affairs. The crowd outside had spotted him, and their angry shouts echoed through the building. Hospital security struggled to maintain order as people pressed forward, demanding answers. In the chaos, Kevin slipped away from his police escort. Overwhelmed by guilt and fear, he found himself in a stairwell, frantically scrolling through his own phone. He had captured something that day too, something he hadn't told anyone about. With shaking hands, he pressed upload. Across town, Mayor Thompson was in crisis mode. Reports of unrest were coming in from all over the city. A protest at the police station had turned ugly, with several arrests made. Social media was ablaze with competing narratives and calls for action. "We need to get ahead of this," the mayor barked at his team. "Where are we on that community meeting?" His chief of staff, Alicia, looked grim. "Sir, it's complicated. Some leaders are refusing to participate unless Officer Hanson is arrested immediately. Others are threatening to boycott if any charges are filed before a full investigation." The mayor slammed his fist on the desk. "Damn it! Don't they see we're on the brink here? Get them in a room together. I don't care how. We need dialogue, not division." As City Hall scrambled to respond, Officer Hanson's family was falling apart. His son, Tyler, had locked himself in his room after a heated argument with his father. "How could you, Dad?" he had shouted. "Everything you taught me about being a good cop, about protecting people, was it all a lie?" Lisa tried to mediate, her heart breaking for both her husband and son. "Please," she begged through the door. "We need to stick together now more than ever." But Tyler wasn't listening. He was online, watching the situation unfold in real time, his worldview crumbling with each new post and video. Back at the hospital, Marcus had finally arranged for Officer Hanson to meet with his father. As they stood outside the IQ, the tension was palpable. "Mr. Washington," Marcus said, his voice tight with emotion, "I need to advise you, as your son, and as an officer of the court, that anything said in this room could have serious legal implications." James nodded understanding. Officer Hanson, pale and visibly shaken, spoke up. "Sir, if you don't want to do this, I understand. What I did, there's no excuse." Before James could respond, Sandra burst into the room. "Marcus, you need to see this," she said, thrusting her tablet towards him. "It's all over the internet." Marcus felt his blood run cold as he watched the video Kevin had uploaded. It showed a different angle of the incident, revealing crucial details that had been missed before. The implications were staggering. As the video went viral, the city seemed to hold its breath. At the police station, the chief watched in disbelief, knowing that every decision made in the next few hours would be scrutinized for years to come. Community leaders huddled in emergency meetings, trying to formulate a response. In living rooms and street corners, people debated what they had seen, lines being drawn and redrawn with each passing minute. And in a hospital room, two men from very different worlds prepared to face each other, each carrying the weight of their actions and the hopes of a divided community on their shoulders. The stage was set for a confrontation that would echo far beyond the walls of that small room. As James Washington looked into the eyes of the man who had brought him to the brink of death, the entire city seemed to pause, waiting to see if healing was possible or if the wounds of the past were simply too deep to overcome. Outside, the crowd grew larger and louder. Inside, monitors beeped steadily, marking the precious seconds of a pivotal moment in time. James took a deep breath, wincing slightly at the pain in his chest, and began to speak. In that moment, with tensions at their breaking point and the future hanging in the balance, no one could predict how the next few minutes would unfold. But one thing was certain: nothing would ever be the same again. As James Washington began to speak, a deafening crash echoed through the hospital. The lights flickered, plunging the room into momentary darkness. When they came back on, chaos erupted in the hallway. "We got a situation," a security guard shouted, bursting into the room. "The protesters have breached the lobby. They're demanding to see Officer Hansen." Marcus felt his heart race. This was exactly the kind of escalation he'd feared. He turned to Officer Hansen, whose face had gone pale. "We need to get you out of here," Marcus said urgently. But before they could move, James reached out, grabbing Officer Hansen's wrist with surprising strength. "No," he said firmly. "We finished this. Now." The tension in the room was electric as James locked eyes with the man who had tased him. Outside, the sounds of angry voices grew louder, punctuated by the breaking of glass and urgent shouts from hospital staff. Suddenly, Sandra's tablet pinged with a notification. Her eyes widened as she read the alert. "Marcus," she gasped, "you need to see this. It's about Kevin." Marcus took the tablet, his brow furrowing as he scanned the breaking news. Kevin had gone missing after uploading the video, and now reports were coming in of a young man matching his description involved in a standoff with police across town. The situation was spiraling out of control faster than anyone could have anticipated. Marcus felt pulled in a dozen different directions: his duty as DA, his concern for his father, the growing unrest in the city, and now Kevin's desperate actions. In City Hall, Mayor Thompson watched the live feeds in horror. The community meeting he'd hoped would bring peace had dissolved into a shouting match, with leaders storming out and making inflammatory statements to the press. "Sir," Alicia said, her voice tight with tension, "we're getting reports of small fires being set downtown. The police are requesting permission to use more forceful crowd control measures." The mayor hesitated, knowing that whatever he decided in the next few moments could either calm the storm or fan the flames into an inferno. Back at the hospital, James Washington's monitor began to beep erratically. The stress of the situation was taking its toll on his weakened heart. A nurse rushed in, pushing past the stunned Officer Hansen. "Everyone out," she ordered. "He needs space." But James refused to let go of Officer Hansen's wrist. "No," he said again, his voice barely a whisper now. "There's something you need to know. Something about that day." Marcus leaned in, torn between concern for his father's health and the urgent need to hear what he had to say. Whatever revelation James was about to share, it felt like it could be the key to everything. Just then, Tisha burst into the room, out of breath and wild-eyed. "Mr. Washington," she panted, "I'm so sorry. I didn't mean for this to happen. The video, there's more to it than I realized." The room seemed to freeze, every person hanging on Tisha's next words. What new twists could possibly change the narrative that had gripped the city? As Tisha fumbled with her phone, the sounds of the approaching crowd grew louder. They were no longer just in the lobby. Somehow, they had made it to this floor. Officer Hansen looked from James to Marcus to the door, conflict written across his face. He was sworn to protect and serve, but right now, he felt like the source of all this pain and anger. "I have to face them," he said suddenly. "It's the only way to stop this from getting worse." Before anyone could stop him, Hansen strode to the door. But as he reached for the handle, James called out, his voice stronger than it had been in days. "Wait," he said. "Before you go out there, there's something everyone needs to understand. About me, about that day, about why I approached your patrol car in the first place." The monitors beeped faster as James struggled to sit up. Sandra moved to stop him, but Marcus held her back. Whatever his father was about to reveal, it was clear that this was the moment everything had been building towards. As James began to speak, the door burst open. The crowd had arrived, their angry faces a stark contrast to the sterile hospital surroundings. Leading them was a face Marcus recognized: Tyler, Officer Hanson's son. "Dad," Tyler said, his voice cracking with emotion, "is it true? Did you really?" The room seemed to hold its breath, a microcosm of the entire city's tension focused in this one critical moment. James Washington, his face etched with pain and determination, looked from Officer Hanson to Tyler, then to the crowd beyond. "Listen to me," he said, his voice growing stronger with each word. "There's something you all need to know, something that changes everything." As James prepared to reveal his secret, the city teetered on the brink. Whatever came next would either heal the growing rifts or tear the community apart forever. The truth, so long buried, was finally about to come to light. James Washington took a deep breath, wincing slightly at the pain in his chest. The room fell silent, all eyes fixed on the frail man in the hospital bed. "That day," James began, his voice gaining strength, "I wasn't just a bystander. I recognized the young man being pulled over. It was my grandson, Kevin." A collective gasp rippled through the room. Marcus felt his world tilt, struggling to process this revelation. James continued, "Kevin's been living with his mother in another state. He was visiting, but he didn't want anyone to know. He's been struggling. I was afraid he might do something reckless." Officer Hanson's face paled as the implications sank in. "Sir, I had no idea." James held up a hand, silencing him. "I know. And Kevin, he panicked when he saw me approaching. That's why he seemed so agitated. He was afraid I'd recognize him, that I'd be disappointed." The tension in the room was palpable as James turned to face the crowd. What happened that day was a tragedy born of fear and misunderstanding. Officer Hanson made a mistake, yes, but so did I, by not being honest from the start. Tyler, still standing in the doorway, looked at his father with new eyes. The anger that had burned so bright began to flicker, replaced by confusion and a glimmer of understanding. Tisha stepped forward, her phone trembling in her hand. "There's more," she said. "The video I took. I didn't realize it at first, but you can hear Kevin call out Grandpa just before the taser was fired. I didn't understand why until now." The room erupted in murmurs as this new piece of information sank in. Marcus felt his legal mind racing, realizing how this changed the entire narrative they'd been operating under. Suddenly, a commotion in the hallway drew everyone's attention. Kevin, flanked by police officers, appeared in the doorway. His eyes were red-rimmed, his posture defeated. "I'm so sorry," he choked out. "This is all my fault. I never meant for any of this to happen." James reached out to his grandson, his eyes filled with compassion. "Come here, son. It's time we face this together." As Kevin moved to his grandfather's bedside, Officer Hanson stepped forward. The room tensed, unsure of what would happen next. "Mr. Washington," Hanson said, his voice thick with emotion, "I can't undo what I did, but I want you to know that I'm truly sorry. I let fear cloud my judgment, and I failed in my duty to protect and serve." James nodded, accepting the apology. "We've all failed in some way," he said. "The question is, what do we do now?" Mayor Thompson, who had arrived moments earlier, saw an opportunity. "We start by talking," he said, addressing the room. "Really talking, and more importantly, listening to each other. This incident has exposed deep wounds in our community. It's time we started healing them." As the mayor spoke, Marcus noticed his mother quietly slip out of the room. He found her in the hallway, tears streaming down her face. "Mom," he said gently, "what is it?" Sandra looked at her son, her eyes filled with a mix of relief and lingering fear. "I just got a call from the doctor," she said. "Your father's latest tests. They found something." Marcus felt his heart drop. "What? What did they find?" Sandra took a deep breath. "It's not the taser that caused his heart problems. They found a blockage that's been there for months, maybe years. If this hadn't happened, if he hadn't come to the hospital when he did." The realization hit Marcus like a wave. In a twisted way, this traumatic event might have saved his father's life. As they re-entered the room, they found an unexpected scene. Officer Hansen was sitting by James's bedside, the two men talking quietly. Kevin stood nearby, Tyler at his side, the two young men finding common ground in their shared experience. Tisha approached Marcus, her face set with determination. "I want to help," she said. "Maybe we can use my video and Kevin's to start a real conversation about police-community relations." Marcus nodded, feeling a glimmer of hope for the first time in days. "I think that's a great idea," he said, "but first, there's something else we need to address." He turned to the room, clearing his throat to get everyone's attention. "I have an announcement to make," he said. "It's about my father's health, and it's going to change how we look at everything that's happened." As Marcus began to explain, the mood in the room shifted once again. The story of James Washington, Officer Hansen, and a community divided had taken yet another unexpected turn. But this time, it felt like the beginning of something new, a chance for understanding, for healing, and for real change. Outside the hospital, the sun was setting on a city forever changed. The road ahead would not be easy, but for the first time in days, there was a sense that they might just find a way forward together. Marcus took a deep breath, facing the room full of people whose lives had become intertwined in ways none of them could have imagined just days ago. "The doctors found a severe blockage in my father's heart," he began. "It's been there for months, undetected. If he hadn't come to the hospital that day..." Marcus's voice trailed off, the implications clear to everyone. A hush fell over the room as the weight of this revelation sank in. James reached out, grasping Officer Hansen's hand. "You may have saved my life," he said softly, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. Officer Hansen shook his head, overwhelmed. I don't know what to say," he stammered. Mayor Thompson stepped forward, seizing the moment. "This is our chance," he said, his voice filled with conviction, "to turn this tragedy into a catalyst for real change. Mr. Washington, Officer Hansen, would you be willing to work with us to help bridge the gap between law enforcement and our community?" Both men nodded, a shared understanding passing between them. Kevin, who had been silent until now, spoke up. "I want to help too," he said. "I need to make this right." As the group began to discuss possibilities, Tisha's phone buzzed insistently. Her eyes whitened as she read the incoming messages. "Guys," she said, her voice urgent, "you need to see this." She held up her phone, showing a live stream from downtown. The protesters, who had dispersed from the hospital, were now gathered in front of the police station. But instead of anger, there was a different energy in the air. People were talking, sharing stories, even hugging officers who had come out to meet them. "It's happening all over the city," Tisha said, scrolling through updates. "People are coming together, starting dialogues. It's like they sensed what was happening here." Marcus felt a surge of hope, but it was tempered by the knowledge that there was still so much work to be done. He turned to his father, expecting to see relief on his face. Instead, he saw a look of deep concentration. "Dad," Marcus said, concern creeping into his voice. "What is it?" James looked up, his eyes clear and determined. "There's one more thing I need to say," he began. "Something I've kept secret for far too long." The room fell silent once again, all eyes on James. He took a deep breath, wincing slightly at the pain in his chest. "Before I retired," he said, "I worked on a community outreach program between veterans and law enforcement. It was making real progress, building trust, opening lines of communication, but it was shut down suddenly, with no explanation." Officer Hansen leaned forward, his brow furrowed. "I remember hearing about that program," he said. "There were rumors, but..." James nodded. "I'd spent years trying to figure out why it was cancelled. And just before all this happened, I found something. Evidence of corruption at the highest levels. People who profit from the division in our community." The implications of this bombshell hung heavy in the air. Mayor Thompson's face had gone pale, while Marcus felt his legal mind racing with the potential ramifications. "That's why I was really there that day," James continued. "I was on my way to meet a whistleblower, someone with concrete proof. When I saw Kevin being pulled over, I thought..." His voice trailed off, emotion overwhelming him. Kevin stepped forward, placing a hand on his grandfather's shoulder. "You are trying to protect me," he said softly, "and I almost ruined everything." The room buzzed with this new information. Officer Hanson stood up, his face set with determination. "Mr. Washington," he said, "I want to help. If there's corruption, we need to root it out. It's the only way to really change things." Marcus nodded, already formulating a plan. "We'll need to be careful," he said. "This goes deeper than we realized. But together?" He looked around the room, at the unlikely alliance that had formed in the crucible of the past few days. "Together, we might just have a chance." As the group began to discuss their next steps, Tisha's phone buzzed again. She looked down, her eyes widening in disbelief. "Guys," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "you're not going to believe this." She held up her phone, showing a breaking news alert. The headline read, "Anonymous donor pledges millions to revive community police outreach programs." As they all stared at the screen in amazement, James smiled softly. "It's not over," he said. "It's just the beginning." Outside the hospital room, the city continued to pulse with newfound energy. The story of James Washington, Officer Hanson, and a community divided had become something more, a beacon of hope, a call to action, and a testament to the power of truth and reconciliation. As night fell, the stage was set for a new chapter. The road ahead would be challenging, filled with obstacles and hard truths. But for the first time in a long time, there was a sense that real change was possible. And it all started with one moment, one mistake, and the courage to face the truth, no matter how difficult. The city held its breath, waiting to see what the new day would bring. Whatever came next, one thing was certain: nothing would ever be the same again.